the Arab Spring, a year that changed the world. My name's Travis. I'm a PSU student, a member of Super. I'm going to be moderating this talk, and I just wanted to welcome everybody to the event today. And we're going to be speaking with Deepa Kumar. She is the Associate Professor of Media Studies and Middle East Studies at Rutgers University. Her work is driven by active engagement with key issues that characterize our era, neoliberalism and imperialism. Her book, Islamophobia and Politics of Empire, is forthcoming from Haymarket Books. She has a previous book, Outside the Box, which is about corporate media, globalization, and the UPS strike. And she's going to be talking about Islamophobia and the Arab Spring. And so without further ado, this is Deepa.
Thank you. Thank you, Travis. Do you mind if I sit there? This thing is, it's in the light. Maybe I'll stand. Do that quick. But please, you should sit there.
Okay. No, let's sit over.
Okay. Thanks. All right. Thank you all for coming out this early Saturday morning. Now, I want to begin by saying that one of the enduring notions about people who live in Muslim-majority countries, particularly Arabs, is this idea that they are just not capable of self-rule, right? And despotism, dictatorships, and so on are best suited for their temperament. So this notion actually is the idea of Oriental despotism. It's had a long history. It begins in the 18th century. And in particular, I'll give you one example of a French writer by the name of Montesquieu, who argued in 1748 that Asia was destined to be despotic because apparently his theory was that the weather actually impacts people's temperament, right? So his theory is that whereas people in cooler regions like Europe were active and brave and all the rest of it, and therefore capable of self-government, people in warmer climates, particularly the Middle East and so on, are supine, to use his words, and therefore servile, effeminate. They're too busy lounging around in the heat to actually create any sort of meaningful change and create self-government. Now, of course, we can laugh at Montesquieu's ridiculous theory, you know, some 200 plus years. But the fact of the matter is that these ideas that somehow democracy has to be brought from the outside, particularly to Arabs, is one that continues to exist even today. So in the lead up, my own experience is in the lead up to the Iraq war, I was part of a coalition, part of an anti-war coalition. All of us were agreed that this was a war for oil. This was a war based on, you know, false premises and so forth. But once the United States intervened and said it's going to bring about democracy, my coalition literally fell apart. So this is not just something which is a view that's held by Americans in general, but it was even part of the anti-war movement. So that's how powerful this mythology is. It's the notion that the white man has a burden, right? The West has a burden to democratize, civilize, and so on, and so forth. And so what I've done is drawn a line of continuity, really from the 18th century to today, to show how powerful these ideas are. So let me give you some examples of these ideas. I started with 1748. I'm going to go next to Lord Balfour, who's infamously known for the Balfour Declaration that recognized the Zionist right to have a state in Palestine. And here's how he puts it. I can't see from this angle. So he says, first of all, look at the facts of the case. These are facts for Balfour, right? Western nations, as soon as they emerge into history, show the beginnings of those capacities for self-government, having merits of their own. You may look through the whole history of the Orientals in what is called, broadly speaking, the East, and you will never find traces of self-government. Never. All their great centuries, and they have been very great, have been passed under despotisms, under absolute governments. All their great contributions to civilization, and they have been great, have been made under that form of government. Conqueror has succeeded conqueror, one domination has followed another, but never in all the revolutions of faith and fortune have you seen one of these nations, of its own motivation, establish what we, from a Western point of view, call self-government. And of course, what Balfour conveniently misses out in all of this, he said this in 1910, is, you know, the British occupation of Egypt and the squashing of the constitutional movement there, not to mention the similar sort of movement in Persia in what would become Iran. Let me give you one more. This is our very own Theodore Roosevelt, and he had this to say back in 1907. He said, "The Egyptians are a people of Muslim fellahin who have never in all time exercised any self-government whatsoever." He was a firm believer in race hierarchies and the white man's burden, and he asserted that Muslims are an inferior people. It is impossible to expect moral, intellectual, and material well-being when Mohammedanism is supreme. So you get the idea. It's the notion that this is how these people have always been, and therefore we in the West, we in the United States, we in Europe, and so on, have to go and civilize them. And by chance, the natives decided that they didn't want to be colonized, they didn't want to be civilized by the West, and so on. There were explanations found to try to somehow rationalize the process by which native peoples fought for self-rule. And so in response to the national liberation movements that had started to emerge in Egypt and India around this time, a little bit earlier, this is how Lord Cromer put it. He said, you know, these people leading these movements are misguided agitators who don't understand what's in their own best self-interest. And I have a quote from him. Lord Cromer, who oversaw the Egyptian occupation in the 1880s, he said, "The real future of Egypt lies not in the direction of a narrow nationalism, oh no, God forbid, which will only embrace native Egyptians, but rather in that of an enlarged cosmopolitanism. In other words, just shut up and realize that you're better off as members of the global British Empire." Now, needless to say, the Arab Spring has completely shattered this myth, I believe, once and for all, in showing that Arabs are just as capable, people in Muslim-majority countries are just as capable as anyone else in throwing off the yoke of dictatorship, in getting rid of entrenched dictators for 2 decades, in the case of Tunisia, Ben Ali, a US-backed and Western-backed dictator, and in the case of Egypt, Mubarak, who ruled for over 3 decades, again, with funds and aid and so on supplied by the United States. And so this notion, I think, has been put to rest in large part. And the mainstream media, despite not exactly being champions of self-determination and so forth, have played a role in this process, because you can't ignore the fact, you can't not cover the millions of people coming out to the various squares. And I think that image will stay on forever in our imagination and force people to rethink some of these myths that have existed for so long. Now, a part of this mythology, a part of this sort of Islamophobic rhetoric related to people who live in Muslim-majority countries is the notion that women, particularly Muslim women, are extraordinarily oppressed, and that Islam is responsible for their oppression, and so on. And so what the West needs to do is, particularly Western white men, need to sit on their white horses, jodhpurs and pith helmets, and rush off to rescue what Gayatri Spivak called brown women from brown men, right? And this ideology, this Islamophobic ideology, also has a long history. Again, I'm going to quote Lord Cromer, who, as I said earlier, was in charge of the the British occupation of, everything is now the US, right? Of Egypt in the 1880s. He says, Islam as a social canker, Islam as a social system has been a complete failure. The degradation of women in the East is a canker that begins its destructive work early in childhood and is eaten into the whole system of Islam. And the solution for Lord Cromer was that Muslims be persuaded or forced into imbibing the true spirit of Western civilization. So here is this man posing as a champion of women's rights in Egypt. And if any of you know who Lord Cromer is, not so coincidentally, he happened to be the founding member and president of the Men's League for opposing women's suffrage back in the UK. So this has really nothing to do with women's rights. It's got nothing to do with women's liberation and everything to do with the justifications needed to continue the process of colonialism. Now we fast forward again to another, a century, and this is of course one of the rationales used for the war in Afghanistan, right? The plight of Afghan women in relation to what the Taliban had done to them and so on becomes one of the rallying cries to foment and to win consent for the invasion of Afghanistan. And I want to read a few quotes from that time. I won't read them all, but this is Laura Bush, who suddenly becomes the pseudo-feminist, you know, championing women's rights. Here's what she says: "Fighting brutality against women and children is not the expression of a specific culture. It is the acceptance of our common humanity, a commitment shared by people of goodwill on every continent. The fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women." So you see here very clearly the ways in which Islamophobic, sexist rhetoric gets used in a very instrumental kind of way to pave the way for the war on terror. I'm going to read Tony Blair's wife, Sherry Blair, at the bottom. "Nothing more symbolizes the oppression of women than the burqa, which is a very visible sign of the role of women in Afghanistan." Now, of course, the dominant image, therefore, in the mainstream media was this. This is the Muslim woman, and this is the Afghan woman. And what you can say about her is she is alone, she is scared, she is powerless, and she's a victim. And therefore, we need to go and rescue her, right? That's the dominant image. That is what Sherry Blair, you know, and this is there's a long tradition, of course, of associating women who in any way cover in whatever form, whether it's a hijab or a full burqa of the sort, is automatically seeing them as oppressed, right? And so that's the dominant narrative that we're seeing back in 2001. Now, of course, what's absent from all of this is any sense of history. What's absent is the fact that, in fact, the attack on women's rights began in 1991 after the proxy war that was waged by the Mujahideen, the holy warriors, which the United States and its allies in the region, particularly Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Israel, funded to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. These guys, out of which Al-Qaeda emerges, as people know. Osama bin Laden was one of the key CIA assets who recruited to the Mujahideen. Now, after that war is complete and the Soviet Union is kicked out, these factions of the Mujahideen then fight with one another and establish a government. It is these forces, by the way, who then take over from the Taliban after the US invasion. The Northern Alliance is nothing if not the Mujahideen of the early 1990s. And actually, they're the ones who started the attack on women's rights, which the Taliban would then take to its most ludicrous extremes. And so, I'm not in the habit of quoting Republican representatives, but I think it's always useful to have people in the establishment say things that we on the left, we on the progressive end of the spectrum already know, because I think it validates it even more so. And this is what Dana Rohrabacher had to say about particularly the Clinton policy of the 1990s. The Clinton administration actually was at the head of trying to establish a pipeline deal, right? There is the world's largest untapped source of oil and of natural gas is found in the Caspian Sea. And Unocal, the company, was interested in building a pipeline through Afghanistan. And so in the 1990s, there was an effort to actually bring the Taliban over to the United States. They were wined and dined, probably not wined, but certainly dined, with the idea of actually building this pipeline. And so in response to that, this is what Dana Rohrabacher had to say. "I'm making the claim that there is and has been a covert policy by this administration to support the Taliban movement's control of Afghanistan. This amoral or immoral policy is based on the assumption that the Taliban would bring stability to Afghanistan and permit the building of oil pipelines from Central Asia through Afghanistan to Pakistan. I believe the administration has maintained this covert goal and kept the Congress in the dark about its policy of supporting the Taliban, the most anti-Western, anti-female, anti-human rights regime in the world. It doesn't take a genius to understand that this policy would outrage the American people, especially America's women." And I did a study, actually, along with one of my colleagues, where we looked at media coverage of what women were going through in the 1990s under the Taliban. And right up until, we did 2 years before 2001, and then we did 6 months after 2001, September 11, 2001, what women were going through barely, registered in the mainstream media. What got more coverage were the antics of the Bush daughters, Jenna, and I forget the other one's name. But suffice it to say, there were, hundreds and hundreds of stories about these women or about the Buddha statues and so on. And then all of a sudden, we go from a dozen or so stories in the mainstream media to thousands and tens of thousands of stories. And suddenly, when a group of women or a group of victims becomes this central to the mainstream discourse, we have to ask ourselves, who benefits from this and what's actually going to happen to these people when a war is made. And of course, what we know, can I see the next? Yes, this is the problem, not having your slides. No, let it be. No? Yeah, just go. Yeah, this is the problem. You don't have your slides here, you don't know what's coming next. What's absent, of course, in all of this media coverage that immediately, that followed immediately after 9/11 is the fact that since the 1950s, girls in Kabul and other cities attended schools. Afghanistan's constitution, written in 1964, ensured basic rights for women, such as universal suffrage, equal pay. Half of university students were women, and women made up 40% of Afghanistan's doctors, 70% of its teachers, 30% of its civil servants, and a small number of women even held important political posts as members of parliament and judges. Most women did not wear the burqa. Even many devout Muslim women wore headscarves and long dresses, but not the burqa. In other words, there isn't a sense in which what caused this attack on women in Afghanistan, and why then is the United States going off to rescue women who clearly don't need rescuing, as you can see from these facts. And I think the best book on this topic is by Malalai Joya. The book is called A Woman Among Warlords, and I would recommend that people check it out because she shows in no uncertain terms that since the US invasion, the situation for the vast majority of Afghan women has actually deteriorated. Well, there are some, there are pockets where, particularly in the city centers, where women have actually, had greater mobility and so on. For the most part, things have actually only gotten worse. And I had the opportunity to do an interview with her, and I'm going to put up a few quotes from that interview. And here are some things she says. First, let me say that after September 11th, the US government threw us from the frying pan into the fire. Over the last 8 years, the US, under the banner of women's rights and human rights, has occupied my country, and millions of men and women have suffered from injustice, insecurity, corruption, joblessness, poverty, etc. But women have suffered more. For them, it is almost as if the Taliban was still in power. After the war, the US brought to power these misogynistic warlords called the Northern Alliance, who are just like the Taliban. These are the same people who ruled between 1992 and 96, and they attacked women's rights and human rights. This time, wearing suits and ties, they have again come into power with the help of the US. That's why today's situation for women is worse, especially in many of the provinces. It is true that in some big cities like Kabul, Mazar-e-Sharif, or Herat, you will see that some women have been able to get jobs and an education, but in most of the provinces, women do not even have basic human rights. The situation is like hell. She was a member of parliament, has endured many death threats and so on, but she's an amazing fighter. It was just incredible to be in her presence and to hold panel discussions and so on. So again, despite the fact that there are women who, or the group RAWA, people have heard of RAWA, the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, who explicitly opposed US war and said we're perfectly capable of our own liberation. There are all of these examples, but again, I want to show some images from the Arab Spring, because yet again, this idea, this notion of Muslim women as being these passive victims, incapable of rescuing themselves, I think that image too has really come under attack. So let me show this. Here we have from Egypt, more. And here is supposedly the perfect victim, isn't it? The woman who cannot act as a political agent on her own behalf, and yet here she is in the middle of these demonstrations. That poster says, Mubarak needs to get out, right? And here's another one. She's standing in the middle with batons and threatening police, obviously able to take care of herself. The brutality, of course, was immense. Okay. More? And here you have women alongside young men, throwing stones, pelting the police. And I especially like this one. You have the sea of police, and right in the middle there, the woman with her hand raised up. Here are more. This one is just so fascinating. It was the time in Egypt when people, not everyone, but certainly large numbers, believed that the military and the people are one. That was the slogan. And so it was possible for little girls dressed in pink to go up and stand on these tanks. And of course that's an extremely brave thing for her to do, even though at the time it was, was considered that the military was on the side of the revolution. And even in Saudi Arabia, you may not have heard of these demonstrations, but in fact there were attempts to try to bring the spirit of the Arab Spring into Saudi Arabia. You see a number of women who were involved in these protests. And Tunisia. And I think that was my last slide. Can you go up? Okay. Oh dear, this was something I had to show. I didn't cue it up. Okay. Essentially, this is an article from, can you go back? This is an article from Time magazine, where they have now come to the realization, and they are pretty much saying, that what the Arab Spring shows is that the women of the Muslim world, that Arab women and so on, are perfectly capable of acting as agents, and it's really shattered the ways in which particularly mainstream journalists and so on start to view women. Okay, now that said, this is another thing I wanted to show, but I'm not going to be able to show because we don't have sound in this room. But one very pivotal moment, I think, in relation to the Egyptian revolution is when a young woman by the name of Asma Mahfouz made a YouTube video urging people to go out and participate in the July 25th demonstration. And you may have heard that this video actually went viral. Millions of people saw the video and so forth. And she became emblematic of a generation of young women who were at the head of the uprisings in Tunisia and in Egypt and so on and so forth. And I'm sorry?
It should be subtitled for the video.
No, sadly.
Well, most of the YouTube ones that were subtitled.
Yeah. It was spoken over. So, unfortunately. Maybe if we have some time, I'll try to see if there is a subtitled version, and we'll see it. But the video I was going to show you is in addition to Asma Mahfouz, and you should see her speaking. She's also a hijabi woman, but she's so confident. She's really young. She's so confident in terms of what the stakes are, why people should come out, and so on. Really inspiring video. And it was a really important moment in that Democracy Now! Really covered Asma Mahfouz in a very good way. And I think it was important in terms of making an argument on the liberal left as well, because I think these ideas of, not just Oriental despotism, but the idea that women, Muslim women in particular, need to be rescued by Christian women or by, feminists in the United States. People know that feminist organizations also gave their consent to the war in Afghanistan. I think the broadcasting of this on alternative media channels like Democracy Now! And elsewhere was pivotal in terms of making that shift, particularly on the liberal left, and for people switching out of earlier sort of prejudices and Islamophobic ideas that they used to have. That said, mainstream media coverage was still very contradictory. I couldn't show you the Time magazine article, but I just want to show you this, the next one. This is something I cut out from my New York Times. And it says here, Tunisians gathered Saturday at a high school of Tunis for a celebration of Ben Ali's government's fall that included musical performances. Tunisia has liberal social policies, abortion is legal, polygamy is banned, and women commonly wear bikinis in the country's beaches and so forth. And of course you can see the contradictions here. The idea that in the West, the way in which women are liberated is through what they don't wear. And, and that is somehow what the women of Tunisia or the women of Egypt are actually seeking. And I thought this cartoon really captures this well. And I think the point that this is making is the idea that women are oppressed. Women face sexism and misogyny regardless of where they live. They just happen to experience it differently. And I think this was one moment where you could actually have solidarity and sisterhood across international borders, because you saw women as agents. And of course, since then, we've seen how badly women have been harassed, sexually harassed, and so on at Tahrir Square and elsewhere. But it's a way in which to get out of that sense in which Western women don't need to go off and rescue their sisters, but can stand and see them as equal and stand in solidarity. And that's what I want to try to come to a close with. Actually, before I go there, that is what I'll close with. But before I go there, I mean, if the Arab Spring has been instrumental in debunking the notion of Oriental despotism, as well as this notion of Muslim women as victims, one of the trends that has actually pushed back against this is, since the Egyptian and Tunisian revolutions, the parties that have come to political power are the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Ennahda in Tunisia, and so forth. And so some commentators have argued that, of course, this is inevitable. What else can we expect from people who live in Muslim-majority countries? They will choose Islamists when given a chance. And so that's played into the Islamophobic rhetoric. And I'm actually going to talk about that and debunk that at the plenary tonight. I just wanted to say that there is a historical reason for why these parties have actually been able to capitalize in the post-dictatorship period. It's because they just happen to be the most organized, and they happen to have the most resources to actually be able to benefit from the political vacuum that's been created. But there's more to it than that. And so what I want to end with is the idea of solidarity. Now, from the first, of course, this conference is called 2011, the year that changed the world. And if the first few actions that inspired the world were the Tunisian and the Egyptian revolutions, we saw that spreading not just to the Middle East, not just to Bahrain, Syria, Yemen, and so on, but we actually saw across the Atlantic, right here in the United States, in Madison, when Governor Scott Walker was trying to push through his anti-union program. I don't know if people have seen the images of this, but the protesters actually carried signs that called Scott Walker Hosni Walker, right? Showing that these are neoliberal attacks in Egypt, they're neoliberal attacks right here in the United States. And some others were carrying signs that said, fight like an Egyptian, sort of an adaptation of walk like an Egyptian. And so that was the first moment where you start to see this solidarity, this empathy between people on an international basis on the idea that we're all screwed by this system of neoliberalism, and we each have to fight and stand with each other in this fight. And then, of course, this spreads to Greece, as well as to Spain. There's the movement of the squares, as it were, people coming out and very openly, sort of drawing inspiration from Tahrir Square in Egypt and setting up and trying to use those strategies as a way to win justice from their governments. And finally, of course, we had the Arab Spring, we had the American Autumn, and that is the Occupy Wall Street movement, which is now, of course, again, gone global. So I think that, for me at least, I've been teaching classes on Islamophobia for a long time, and of course you make some headway when you teach classes. But more than anything else, social movements, historical changes of these sorts do far more than any classroom ever can, or any book ever can. And so, to me, it's just been so inspiring that people have not only been able to put aside these stereotypes, but actually see one another as equals in a struggle against a system that is oppressive to all of us. So, with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deepa. That was a wonderful talk, very informative. We are now going to open up the room to discussion and question and answer. We are going to do it a little different than the normal way of asking a question and then having Deepa respond directly. Rather, we're going to have a discussion in the room where anybody is free to comment on any question or comment that another person in the room makes. And we will then bring it back to Deepa after a few questions have been raised throughout the room, and sort of take the conversation from there. So the way that I'm going to do it is I'm going to keep a stack up here, and if you raise your hand, I will put you down on the list and call you by an article of clothing that you're wearing and where you're sitting in the room. And then we will have the, I'll try to limit your conversation to 1 to 2 minutes, and we will have, excuse me, sorry, we can, I'll bring Deepa back, I'm sorry. I'll bring Deepa back when we get to the point that there's a couple questions in the room. So with that, anybody who has a question, please, you can just raise your hand and I'll call on you by an article. The gentleman over here.
How would she distinguish Islamophobia from other imperialist movements, such as the American conquering the Indians of the West, or Great Britain in taking over India, or the United States working on Spain and Cuba and the Philippines, or any number of other, or Vietnam, the Americans saving the poor Vietnamese people? How would she distinguish Islamophobia from those other imperialist movements?
And feel free to raise your hand at any point, and when I make eye contact with you, that means I have you down on the list.
My question was that Deepa mentioned the Occupy movement going global. By that, I'm wondering, do you mean national or like actually global? Like there's uprisings in other countries all around the world, crowds of people doing the same thing or something supporting that?
In the back with the glasses.
Just a couple comments on Asma Mahfouz. I was so inspired by her YouTube that I went to Cairo last spring to meet her, and luckily got to do that. Just a couple things. So if you watch that YouTube, there's a very, very sharp sort of feminist angle to it that I don't think she quite meant. In the YouTube, she says, if you are men, you will come out. And the idea of this young woman sort of challenging these males, it's really the heart of that video. She sort of baits these guys to come out. This was just before January 28th, when everybody was afraid to come out. It was a big turning point. Then when I got to meet her, it was a meeting, and half of the meeting was right on revolutionary feminists. Although she didn't speak a lot, she was sort of this curious Buddha figure who just sort of sat there and radiated authority. It was a fascinating place. And just one other thing, though, that what happens, though, and so after I met her, I went to this radical cafe in downtown Cairo, and I was talking to this Egyptian journalist. I said, oh, I just got to interview Asma Mahfouz. And he goes, poof, who's she? Why? What gives her a right to get on television? And that's one of the things that happen in these kind of leaderless movements. If somebody becomes even slightly prominent, they can often be sort of hit from below that, oh my God. It was just interesting. I don't know if it was a sexism or it was this whole business that anybody who stands up and becomes slightly prominent in that movement at that time, a lot of envy and jealousy would come back.
So I do have an open stack right now.
Okay. Just very quickly, I don't, people should answer each other's questions and, come in more. But I realize I didn't explain what Islamophobia is, and so let me do that. By Islamophobia, I mean anti-Muslim racism, right? It's a way in which to systematically discriminate against, it's a way in which to create a caricature and a stereotype of all Muslims. And Islamophobia, really, this ideology, this anti-Muslim ideology, has been the handmaiden of the war on terror, right? Whether I talked about two examples. I talked about, Oriental despotism being sort of the backdrop for the U.S. occupation of Iraq, and I spoke about the rescuing Afghan women and so on. But there's a whole bunch of other stuff that comes into the language of Islamophobia post 9/11. And of course, Islamophobia wasn't born after 9/11. There's a long history of anti-Muslim racism. The examples that I gave you from the 17th century and so on, people have written about this, particularly Edward Said, the former Edward Said of Columbia University. He has a book called Orientalism, where he talks about how the project of colonialism was very much implicated in this form of anti-Muslim racism. And the question is, why do we need racism, right, to justify colonialism? In what way is Islamophobia different from Vietnam, from Spain and Cuba and all the rest of it? In every instance, particularly after the American Revolution, the French Revolution, to some extent the English Revolution and so on, when we entered a period in human history where notions like equality, fraternity, freedom, and so on now become something that should be applied to all human beings, it's in that context that if you're going to go off and on the one hand enslave an entire continent of people in order to have them work in plantations or what have you, you need an ideology to say, well, we are all equal, but some people are more equal than others, right? And so it's okay that, you know, like the US Constitution did, African slaves were considered 3/5 of a man. And so as long as they're inferior, and this is the ideology of racism, the idea that there are different races of people, race being a completely arbitrary designation, not based in biology in any way, shape, or form, and that somehow people of a particular skin color or of a certain national origin are inherently and naturally inferior. And of course that becomes the basis to say, yes, we have the white man's burden to go off and civilize them, to go off and colonize them, and so on. So racism has always been at the forefront of any attempt to colonize, whether it's India, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Spain doing this, or whether it is Britain doing this, and so forth. And today, of course, Islamophobia is the key basis from which to justify the occupations of Iraq, which is coming to an end, but also Afghanistan, and more recently to also justify what happened with the NYPD CIA controversy. I live there, and I'm in the middle of all of this, and my union, the AAUP-AFT, we just passed a resolution against these sorts of violations of civil liberties. But it's really disheartening to see that 60% of New Yorkers actually support this kind of spying, not seeing, for instance, how this form of spying, this form of racial profiling actually has a long and horrible history in this country, whether we're talking about COINTELPRO, where people like Martin Luther King were spied upon in these kinds of ways, and so on and so forth. This is, you know, this sort of thing should not be allowed to happen. But it does happen to the extent that all Muslims are somehow seen as being responsible for the events of 9/11. And that's what Islamophobia is. It's the vilification and the demonization of an entire group of people based on their religion. So I'll just stop there, I've spoken enough, and we'll come back to some of the other comments and questions. I'd like to speak about both these, but
Yes.
Well, I'm shocked as I sit here to think that in my Latin American Studies class, I was told the same thing about people in Latin America couldn't govern themselves because they brought all their political ideas from Spain. And it was the Arab influence that went through Spain that made them used to and only capable of living under despotism. So this myth just keeps on rolling.
So there's an open stack.
How does she see Islamophobia playing out in Syria?
I just wanted to take up the question about the Occupy movement. Obviously, it's gone national. You know, we're out here in Portland, it's going on in New York still. I was just in Chicago, folks are still really active there, regardless of whether there's a camp or not. But really, if you think about it, it is a global movement, and just like we took inspiration, you know, really from the square occupations and that were, you know, across Europe, you know, in the middle of 2011, as well as kind of before that, since they have more of a history of getting out there and just going on a general strike, which is awesome. I think there were 12 in Greece in the past year, by the way. But really, I think that one of the best examples is a call of action came from Portland for February 29th. And while it's been taken up across the United States, Mexico City and Australia have also taken up that call. So there's going to be international demonstrations, and it's the same for all of these big days of action across Occupy. It's really just feeding into the energy from other places and looking at, you know, what has been working in Spain and trying it out here and seeing if it works, and then Spain seeing, you know, what we're doing and the adaptations that we've made and kind of all of us using this collective knowledge because of the media and how much that has helped us be able to communicate with each other and learn from each other. So it really has gone global, and we'll continue to see kind of people taking from other countries' movements.
I would like to interject a question as well. I'm curious to what degree some of these Islamophobic myths have been internalized by people within Muslim societies, Muslim countries, especially among the people educated within Western systems, and to what degree that is having an effect now. Particularly, I guess I'm interested about Tunisia in how the sort of educated elite have this real fear of Islam in a way that I've been hearing coming out of Tunisia, and conversely also what the Islamists may think about those people, the secular left in those countries. Yes.
And I think the problem may be that one group of people then speaks for a religion, whether it's Osama bin Laden speaking for Islam, whether it's the Ku Klux Klan speaking for Christianity, or Rick Santorum. Not much difference between him and the Ku Klux Klan, but as a mainstream Christian, then I get upset when somebody that's totally off the wall, like Rick Santorum or Newt Gingrich, speaking for Christianity. And so I think the problem for Christians, and this was a, kind of a re-education for me, was learning, my friend here who's Muslim from Kosovo, meeting people from other countries, becoming friends with them, getting over the prejudice, all the misinformation that we've been fed, really our whole lives. And then once you go to the Middle East, like I did, and then you meet people, and I was in Iran 2 years ago, and then you get over all this misinformation you've been fed ever since you've been born.
Ellen, and then Hannah, followed by the gentleman with the leather jacket.
Well, I have a comment and then a question. The comment is relating to what you were saying. Basically that people like Osama bin Laden and Rick Santorum, we view them as speaking on behalf of these religions because that's what our media gives them the authority to do.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that we have these stereotypes and that we think of Osama bin Laden as being a representative of something is because our media works really hard to make that the case and to block out these other perspectives. Like this awesome presentation that showed us all these voices that are instrumental, like within these other countries that we are completely oblivious to and just don't hear about, because so much of what's happening in the world is blocked out from ever reaching us because of the way our media works. But I was in Palestine for 5 months, and it was really interesting for me to be there as an American woman and have these different interactions, see how I was treated very differently by Palestinian men than by American men, and lots of people would come up to me and tell me, we treat our women better than you do in your country, and I would just say, okay, and I have no idea, like, I haven't drawn any conclusions. I just sort of, like, was in this observational mode, feeling like I wasn't, like, I don't have enough perspective to draw any conclusions, but I definitely am interested to hear your perspectives. It's obvious, I don't think it's something you can quantify as, like, we have more freedom, or women have more freedom, but just, like, I don't really know how to hold those very contradictory perspectives and understand that.
Okay, so now I like where this conversation is going. I liked your question, Travis, just looking or asking, how much is this Western point of view kind of, I mean, obviously we know Western culture is extremely hegemonic in a lot of ways, so it makes sense that, scholars and thinkers and politicians, etc., in countries all over the world are going to be influenced by, like, Western points of view, Western education, Western sensibilities, but just wondering, what is the extent of that? And kind of working off that, I'm very interested by the Muslim feminist movements, and seeing the progression of that over maybe the past 50 years or so, where 50 years ago it was very Western, or my perception is that it was more Western-centric, and there was a lot of emphasis on emulating the West and taking off the hijab, and now, today, you know, we see people like Asma, who's on YouTube in a hijab, like, you know, as a new face of the Muslim feminist movement. And I also think seeing a woman like that is very interesting because she can kind of act as yet another voice to this plurality of the Muslim voices we should be hearing in the media, because we either have Osama bin Laden on one hand, or the opposite extreme, which is, you know, an apologist, not necessarily, you know, it could be a very intelligent person, but an apologist Muslim who feels the need to take a very secular, accommodating point of view towards the West. And so I wonder what anyone, including Deepa, has to say about perhaps the rise of a third alternative, you know, or a plurality of third middle alternatives that are not completely catering to the West on one hand, but also moving past that kind of gut reaction to the West that ends up often taking a fundamentalist tone, whether in the feminist movement or otherwise.
With the leather jacket.
My question was, I knew that there was general elections in Egypt recently, but I was unsure if the country was still ruled by a military tribune. And my question was, do you think that the military may not give up power? Like, it may still, like say, it gives people elections, but it really doesn't give up any power. Like, it still maintains a firm grip on what the policies in the country are.
Great. And we have the gentleman in the blue by the window.
Yeah. First, I wanted to say, Deepa, thank you for coming out. I've been a big fan of your writing, and I can't wait for your book to come out later this year. Well, I can answer your question real quickly. Yes, Egypt is still ruled by military council. Mubarak was kicked out, but the military, you know, same institution essentially is in power, minus the figurehead. Not that he was a figurehead, but minus Mubarak. In alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood is the main political party that is most definitely united with the military, and I would argue against the aspirations of millions of people who want even more than, you know, what they've wanted last year. But I'll let Deepa get into that more. I wanted to comment, you know, on the issue of Islamophobia in terms of its use on an international basis and in the United States. And I think use of Islamophobia in the war on terror, justifying the war in Afghanistan, is just the latest version of the white man's burden. That, you know, the United States basically and other European countries know what's best, and people around the world, you know, don't know anything and don't know how to take care of themselves. And, you know, the reality is it's an ideology that's used, you know, in the language of Occupy, the 1% versus the 99%. The wars are fought by the 1%, which oil corporations are going to control the oil in the Middle East, who's going to have access to natural gas in Central Asia and Afghanistan, or around Afghanistan. And so Islamophobia is just the latest example to dehumanize people over there to justify U.S. Intervention. And then in terms of what it means, I think there's also, it's really important to talk about what it means here in the United States. It is, you know, I mean, a country that grew up on the genocide of Native Americans, on the slavery of Africans, and the segregation of African Americans, and countless other forms of racism. Islamophobia is the latest way for the U.S. government to keep us fighting one another, to keep the 99% from uniting by being afraid of people who they would like us to think are different. I think it's total bullshit. And then, but it's even more sinister than that, because it's also used to justify an attack on civil liberties that we've seen continued under their Obama administration, that are going to be the latest version of the stuff that Deepa talked about, like COINTELPRO and stuff. This stuff, it's going to start against Muslims or Palestinian rights activists or whatever, but it's going to be used against all of us. So we need to oppose any attacks on anybody, whether it's Muslim or Arab or Palestinian activists, because first of all, it's not it's unjust, and all the cases that I've heard is just the latest example to justify putting political prisoners in jail. But it's going to make it a lot harder for all of us to build a united movement against the 1%. You know, and then the last thing I wanted to say real quick is, I think in terms of what it means now, we have to be really crystal clear. I think, you know, it's not just like the U.S. The NATO intervention in Libya, the UN interventions, like these are bodies that are dominated by the United States or other world powers, and I think we have to be a sort of a knee-jerk, anti-imperialist, you know, humanitarian intervention, just another version of the world's powers justifying what I think is the same sort of white man's burden going into to Libya, going into Syria, and no, we have to be clear, U.S. or any of these bodies should not be invading any countries, and just like all the stuff Deepa said around Afghanistan, that is going to be what creates the space for the people in Syria. If we're not bombing them, if the U.S. military isn't funding the dictators, that's what's going to create the best possible scenarios, because people all over the world want the same thing that we want here in the U.S. They want to be able to take care of their families, raise their kids, have education, have health care. They can't do that when our country and other world powers are bombing the crap out of them.
I'm going to bring Deepa back, and then I can...
Very quickly. I mean, I just want to put some, statistics forward here. Part of what's happened internally in the United States since 9/11 is a politics of fear has been mobilized, right? We are asked to be suspicious of Muslim, Arab, or Arab-looking people, people who look like me and so on, because of course we're guilty until proven innocent. And that's, of course, the logic of the NYPD spying, the NYPD CIA spying, I should say, that's been going on. But this whole fear-mongering really has parallels with the Cold War, with McCarthyism, and the ways in which the communist menace, the Reds, were everywhere. They were under your tables, and they were in your bathrooms, and so on. Actually, this reminds me of a poster from it's an ad for Kleenex, I think, or some form of toilet paper. It says, "Is your bathroom breeding Bolsheviks?" And the ad was basically that if you don't have soft bathroom tissue, then you're going to have disgruntled employees who will take, a stance against the all-American attitude. So, but you get the idea. People who were alive, many people here could probably speak to the duck and cover, the ways in which, you would have to, if you were in school, a siren would go off and you'd have to duck underneath your tables and chairs in preparation for a nuclear attack, because of course a chair is going to protect you from it. And the question is, of course, why is that? Because a chair isn't going to protect anyone. It's about creating so much fear among people that you give your consent, not only to the attack on radicals and leftists and progressives in the US and against movements that could actually challenge what the US was doing in the Cold War, but so as to win consent for, the Cold War and the Hot War, whenever it became hot and so on. It's the same thing that's happening right now. We're told to be afraid of Muslims and Muslim Americans and Arabs and so forth. Does anybody know the number of Americans who were killed last year due to an act of terrorism by an Arab or a Muslim or somebody else in this country last year? Does anyone know that number?
Zero.
Zero. It's zero. A study recently released by University of North Carolina puts that number at zero. There were about 14,000 deaths, murders last year, not one of them attributable to terrorism. And so this is a completely manufactured fear in order to justify what's going on abroad and what's going on in this country. So I think that's what we've got to keep front and center, is that's how Islamophobia works. It's just the green scare. I've called it the green scare. The green scare today is exactly like the red scare of yesteryear. Now, there have been a number of really excellent comments and questions and so on. I don't intend to monopolize all the time, so I'll just say a very few brief things about it. On the question of Asma Mahfouz, and the point that you made, which is that in the video she actually challenges men to come out and be part of the January 25th demonstration. She wasn't the first person to do this. If people have been following during the Mahalla strikes, the Mahalla textile workers strikes, it was women actually who led these strikes, which, and when they did that, they challenged their male co-workers. They said, come on, you better come out as well and demand better wages and so forth. So Egypt didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of a decade of organizing by men and women in that country, completely fed up with the neoliberal policies of Mubarak, and women have been central to that. And that particular appeal, that if you should come out if you're a man, has been used in the past as well. Now, in terms of how people see one another, in terms of, what sexism looks like in various parts of the world and so on, is it better, is it worse, and so forth. I mean, I would only say that it looks different in different places, right? How women experience sexism really looks different in different places. I don't think that there's anything uniform in that sense, but I do think that that one aspect of history that is not paid enough attention to in the West, in the United States in particular, is the number of women's movements that have existed in the Arab world, whether we're talking about Morocco, whether we're talking about Egypt, or Iran for that matter, which has one of the strongest feminist movements, both secular feminists and Islamic feminists, right? Women have been fighting for at least a century for various kinds of rights. And I did a little bit of work around the million-person signature campaign and so on and so forth. And it's really, I wrote a piece about the feminist movement in Iran where I said, my God, given what women are going through in this country, we could absolutely learn a thing or two from the mobilizing strategies that people are using in places like Iran and Egypt and so forth, because our rights have been attacked systematically since the 1960s, since the women's movement ended back in the 1960s. Now, in terms of your question, Travis, it's a great question. I don't think we can exhaust that discussion here. Again, the starting point is no group of people is homogeneous, right? On the one hand, you have, of course, in every country, the extreme Islamists. These are the people who take to violence. These are the Al-Qaedas. These are the, AKPs and so on and so forth. The way in which one scholar put it is that there are mutually reinforcing stereotypes. So in this country, we have the likes of the Franklin Grahams, yes. The far right-wing, evangelical fundamentalists and so on, who say, oh my God, these Muslims are just out to take over the United States, to create a caliphate in this country, to force Sharia law onto us and so on. And then you have their counterparts who say, yes, that's exactly what we're trying to do. There are far right-wing elements in every single country. And you can't take that, and that's the problem, is you can't take just that one section of people and somehow paint everybody else with that picture, right? And so that's the starting point of, I think, any discussion of how we look at the diversity of views in every single country, the Middle East included. And I just want to say a little bit about, given Western hegemony and given the power of these ideas all over the world, are there people who, in Tunisia, in Syria, in Libya, and so on, who actually accept these ideas? Absolutely. Historically, the term given to these individuals are comprador intellectuals, right? These are folks who actually bolster colonialism. These are folks who benefit from imperialism and who do the bidding of the colonial overlords and so forth. And it's not to say that it uniformly impacts everyone in the same kind of way. Frantz Fanon, people may have read his book, Black Skin, White Masks, and he talks about what is it like to be a black man in Algeria under French occupation, and how does it mess with you psychologically to have to put on a white mask to actually blend into these societies, right? So even the comprador intellectuals, he writes sympathetically about them to show how much it disturbs them and how much it dehumanizes them. And of course, he writes about the French as well to show that their brutality, by the way, the levels of violence in Algeria, that the French meted out are just stunning. And how that distorts, that kind of violence even messes up and distorts the psyche of the colonizer, right? So just wanted to throw that out there, but to say that there's a great book by Hamid Dabashi, it's called Brown Skin, White Masks, where he talks about people who he refers to as native informers. And this 2 weeks ago, not the latest issue of Newsweek, but the one before that, there is a cover story by this woman, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She is a extreme Islamophobe. She actually, there are a whole series of people who've been recruited by the neocons and by the imperialists and so on to provide cover, because as long as you're a person of color and you can say exactly the same thing that they're saying, it gives legitimacy, right? So you have the Ayaan Hirsi Alis, you have the Irshad Manjis, you have the Wafa Sultans and so on, and so there's a whole industry of people who've actually become quite rich from peddling these kinds of stories. And her whole argument, you should go read her article in Newsweek. It's ridiculous. It's completely in line with the Islamophobia. But suffice it to say that there are those kind of people. There's no doubt about it, just as there are people in Libya who actually invited NATO, US intervention. There are people in Syria. Certainly not everyone in the Syrian National Council is in this position. The Syrian National Council, which is leading the occupation, the resistance movement, so on, has a motley number of groups within it, and so forth, but sections of it are looking to the West to actually, liberate Syria and so forth. And so I think we have to look concretely at each situation to see what role is each individual playing and whose interests does it actually serve. And that takes some work, that takes some labor. It's not an easy, sort of yes or no kind of answer. And I think part of what the Arab Spring has done is force us to get out of our comfort zone and to actually start to look at, other parts of the world, and particularly the role of the US in these other parts of the world. I don't know whose joke this was, but empire and war, US empire and war is actually meant to be a way in which Americans learn about other parts of the world, and that's true. In a way, it forces everyone to actually learn about the politics of Syria, Libya, and all the rest of it to be able to explain it. So I'll stop there.
I'd like to hear more about Islamophobia from the standpoint of Muslims living in America, okay? Because that's what concerns me, because, you take, for instance, the recent events that happened in Afghanistan about the Qurans that were burned, and there's a lot of violence going on right now in Afghanistan in reference, because of that event, because, I had my epiphany when I was in Vietnam. I was a medic in Vietnam, and so when I came back from Vietnam, my greatest revelation of me being in the U.S. military in Vietnam was the realization that I was the enemy in Vietnam. That was the most profound realization I had, that I was the enemy. And so, that everything is. My awakening has been as a result of that. But I'm concerned about Muslims living in this country. I mean, how difficult is it for you to deal with living in a country, being a Muslim, and knowing that this country commits acts of violence every breath I take? Because in Vietnam, we committed mass murder. The United States committed mass murder every single day in Vietnam. Okay? We bombed civilian targets on purpose. We fired artillery rounds on civilian targets on purpose. We dropped napalm on Vietnamese villages on purpose, knowing that they were innocent civilians. Okay? That's what we did. That's what the vast majority of the American people have no idea what we did. And so my concern is, it must be difficult being a Muslim and also living in America, and also I'd like to know more about what's it like for you being a professor at Rutgers. Are you feeling that stress? Are you now saying to yourself, oops, maybe I can't say that? What is the fear level for Muslims in this country? Because this is a dangerous country. I mean, I'll just put it right out, man. I mean, the vast majority of the American military that have served in Iraq and Afghanistan have a very low opinion of Muslims. Just like in Vietnam, I never used the word gook, but in Vietnam, most of the soldiers I served with in Vietnam, that was a common word to use, gook. I can remember one time, and I'll end this story. I can remember one time, I was in Vietnam in 1970-71. I was seeing the rapid disintegration of American involvement in Vietnam. I was seeing the homicides, suicides, rampant heroin addiction, shootouts, racial violence, all that stuff. I was seeing America just coming apart, you know. And I remember when I was in Vietnam in '71, Lieutenant William Calley had been found guilty, okay, for his act in the My Lai massacre in 1968, when the United States military massacred 504 Vietnamese civilians at point-blank range, okay? And I can remember I was in an aid station in an armored personnel carrier drove up because Calley had just been found guilty of that crime. And this is 1971. He committed the My Lai massacre, of course, was 1968. And an armored personnel carrier drove up to the aid station, and on the front, the crew had written, "Kill a goop for Calley." They had painted that on the front of that armored personnel carrier, which is like a small tank, because that's what we're dealing with. You know, we're dealing with the fact that most Americans, I hate to say this, and I'm not, please hear me when I say this, especially Muslims in this country. I know Americans in this country. I know how incredibly racist a lot of Americans are. And I believe that the vast majority of Americans living in this country could care less whether Muslims take another breath.
Thank you, sir.
I hate to say that, but I believe that.
I do have an open stack now. We have about 15 more minutes for conversation.
Yeah. In addition to manufactured threats, there's also manufactured conflict. This has been going on as a result of Western imperialism for way over 100 years. Practically all of Africa has been devastated by the efforts at divide and conquer by the British, now by the Americans leading NATO. The Iran-Iraq War is a good example. The United States, through Israel, supplied arms to Iran. The United States directly supplied arms to Iraq. Iraq invaded Iran. You had one of the worst wars of the 20th century, over 1 million people killed. It weakened both Iran and Iraq. This was intentional, and this is how it's done. Now, an interesting ongoing case is Pakistan. Ever since the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947, which is interesting in itself, something that really is in the interest of divide and conquer, and the British were ready with a plan and a border. The Pakistanis, who have usually been ruled by their military and are well known to have dictatorial form of government, have been supported with billions of dollars in military aid by the United States every year. And the excuse that's given is that Pakistan needs us because Pakistan is dysfunctional. And we need to prop up the government and give the military the support so that the whole place doesn't come apart. And in fact, the Pakistani military and a lot of the government leaders and industrialists and so on depend on this US money for their income. And they support this narrative of a dysfunctional Pakistan. One of the latest bits of theater to go on in Pakistan has been the false killing of Osama bin Laden at Abbottabad. This was an incident in which the United States government and the Pakistani government cooperated. Pakistan supplied the fake site at Abbottabad where supposedly Osama bin Laden was killed, and the United States supplied the overall narrative of a false attack by US Navy SEALs, and all of it was theater. And the supposed disagreement and exchange of words between the United States and Pakistan in the aftermath of that fake event of the killing of, so-called killing of Osama bin Laden is likewise theater. Now, yet another example is that of David Coleman Headley, the U.S. Pakistani CIA agent who admitted to planning the horrific Mumbai attacks that killed 160-some people.
Do you have a question, sir?
So anyway, that's it.
Thanks. Okay, I'll take one last question, and then we're going to wrap it up with Deepa. And actually, this gentleman back here.
In Syria, the Arab countries around that have been giving weapons to the rebels. Do you think that NATO should have an active role in helping the rebels, like in Libya? No? Okay.
Did you have a quick question?
Yes, I'd like to know more about what Muslim women in this country are thinking about what's going on in the Arab Spring and what's going on with them and how they see women's place in the U.S. You were talking about the difference, and I'd like to hear more about that, and I would appreciate it if, since part of this discussion is about women and how they're viewed, if men could take a little less time space during discussions.
So before I bring Deepa back, I just want to encourage everyone to check out the Haymarket book room in the other room across the hall. We have lots of books, including Deepa's last book, Outside the Box, and many other informational articles and journals. So please check that out. Also, if you're not signed up for the Super listserv, please do that. We have sign-up sheets at the registration table. You can sign up and be invited to events like this in the future. So without further ado, I'll bring it back for Deepa to wrap up.
Okay. Yeah, just very quickly, there will be plenty of sessions at this conference where we're going to be continuing this discussion about Syria, Egypt, and so on. So I'll just be very quick in response to the question about whether the US or NATO should arm the rebels. Emphatically and absolutely no. Because if there's anything that the history of US imperialism has shown, it never actually intervenes on the behalf of people anywhere, but always on its own behalf. And not on the behalf of ordinary people here either, right? It acts on behalf of the rich in this country, the 1%, as the Occupy Wall Street movement has shown. Afghan women were not liberated in Afghanistan, and we can go all the way back to 1898, where the excuse to make war with Spain, the Spanish-American War, was about liberating the Cubans. Didn't happen. The Filipinos didn't happen. Waterboarding, actually, as a practice of torture, was first started in the Philippines. So it's worth reading this history to see how US intervention is really never on behalf of other people, but always in the interest of empire and power. And I think Asad Abu Khalil is going to be addressing that in the next session, so I won't anticipate what he's going to say. But I realize I didn't say anything about Hannah's question earlier in terms of, is there a third position? She asked, on the one hand, we have the position of the United States and the West, and right now the opposition, it seems, is coming from the Islamists. So is it possible to have a third way or a third alternative? And actually, this is what I'm going to focus on in some depth tonight at the plenary, and that is that movements of the left have always existed in non-Western societies, in the Arab world, in North Africa, in the Middle East more generally. And the problem is that these movements, particularly secular nationalism, which has had popular support in the Middle East, in North Africa, and so on for at least the last century, was largely crushed in part by what the United States did. The US, of course, saw the Islamists as allies, as bulwarks against secular nationalism and against the left, and so funded them, armed them, etc., and therefore pushed these ideas into the margin. Of course, there's also an internal history in that secular nationalism didn't deliver, the left didn't deliver, and so on. And in that vacuum, the parties that were able to actually make political hay were the Islamists, and keep in mind that they get tons of money from Qatar, from Saudi Arabia, and so on. So it's a historical problem that we're facing, not the lack of interest in secular left alternatives. That history has existed for a long time, and even now, those forces are organizing. They're much smaller because their numbers have been reduced, but they do exist. So the socialist revolutionaries in Egypt, for instance, have been organizing in the working class and all the rest of it. And I think it's from there that an alternative can be born. So both in Tunisia and in Egypt, a key reason why those revolutions were successful in toppling dictators is because workers were involved in it, right? In Tunisia, the Labour Federation, the UGTT, played a decisive role at the key moment, and then Ben Ali was gone. Similarly, Mubarak could outlast all the demonstrations at Tahrir Square, but because of the massive strikes, actually the week after that is when he actually stepped down. And since then, an independent federation of workers has been formed with over 1.5 million members. They also have a political party that's still in the infancy. And I think it's from there that you're going to start to see an alternative being born. Yikes, okay. Very quickly in terms of Islamophobia in the United States, how Muslims experience that and so on. I mean, there are several books that I can recommend. Mustafa Bayyoumi's book, How Does It Feel to Be a Problem, I think is the title of the book. Stephen Salisbury, a Philadelphia Inquirer journalist, written a book called Muhammad's Ghost. A bunch of other, really good documents. I mean, how do you think it feels, right? Can you imagine how the Japanese Americans felt when over 100,000 were rounded up and put into concentration camps after Pearl Harbor? It feels awful. It feels horrible. And I have my students routinely tell me about how particularly hijab-wearing women will have insults hurled at them. Recently, a student of mine had a slushie thrown at her, etc. You know, it's a daily humiliating experience. But part of what that does is it gives you some confidence to fight back, because you realize you can't just take this. You can't just sit back and accept this logic, especially because the truth is on our side, right? Muslim Americans are not a threat, right? If you think about the number of people who died last year, I gave that figure, 0, right? From so-called terrorism. The number of people who died last year from lack of access to healthcare is 45,000. 45,000 Americans died because they don't have access. That's the problem. Those are the issues that we need to be focusing on and fighting and pushing back. And in fact, that is actually what's been happening over the last 2 years, particularly after the so-called Ground Zero Mosque controversy, which was basically a proposal to build something like a Y, right, the YMCA, about 2.5 blocks away from the site of the former World Trade Center. And of course, the far right, the Islamophobic warriors, as I call them, made hay of this and created a completely poisonous atmosphere around this issue, and people really started to fight back. People in the Muslim community, as well as their allies, in every single community. I was part of the coalition in New York City, the NYC Coalition to Stop Islamophobia. And we had all sorts of people on September 11th when their side, the Islamophobes, the Pamela Gellers, and all of these, rabid racists. I mean, the things that come out of these people's mouths are stunning, right? They compare the Quran to Mein Kampf and all the rest of it. It's stunning. When we called a counter demonstration against them, our side had about 5,000 to 8,000 people of all stripes. There were women fully veiled, there were women not veiled, there were white, black, Latina, Latino people. This is New York City. This is what New York City looks like, and these were the people who came out. Whereas their side, they mostly bussed people in from outside, largely middle-aged, white, conservative people carrying these signs which said Sharia and blood dripping out of it and so forth. Oh, can I just say one comical sort of thing that came of this? One of my friends actually went to do some reconnaissance of their demonstration. And there was a speaker, all sorts of speakers were there, Geert Wilders, who's this racist politician from the Netherlands and so on. So one of the speakers at their rally said, we don't like these Muslims because they're anti-women. Everyone in the crowd was like, yeah. We don't like these Muslims because they are anti-human rights, yeah. And they said, we don't like these because they're anti-gay. Silence, right? The memo hadn't gone out that you need to do pink washing with the rank and file to present the United States as being this great beacon of freedom and liberty and so on, as a way to demonize Muslims and as a way to demonize Muslim majority countries. So I'll just start to come to a close with this. I think that, I agree with the points that were made earlier by you, but I really don't think that anti-Muslim racism is widespread. I think that people from a politics of fear, give their consent to the kind of things that are going on, but that is, an inch deep and a mile long. I think it can easily be cut through. And when we organize, when we have protests, these ideas immediately start to break down. I mean, the reason why the people like Terry Jones, who wanted to burn a Quran, last year. The reason why not one single Quran was burnt on September 11th is because about 300 to 500 Floridians actually showed up outside this church and said, we will not allow this to happen. Mainly white people who showed up and said, we will not let this happen. And so that's the way to push back. I mean, racism has always been fought by movements from below that actually say, and by multiracial compositions of people saying we will not take this kind of thing. And in fact, I think the last thing I'll say is the 2010 elections, many politicians actually use this kind of Islamophobia. I show some of these ads in my classes. They're atrocious. Not one of those candidates actually won, because the issue that was on people's mind was the economy, as it should be. While the 1% gets richer, the rest of us, having a hard time keeping up with our bills, our houses, and all the rest of it. So I do think that Americans are not inherently racist, but I think that anti-Muslim racism has to be organized in the form of protests, in the form of movements to actually push back against it. So, thanks.
Thank you so much. So we have about a 15-minute break before the next session. Feel free to get some coffee and bagels in the other room. Check out the